Hello, this is Silas. I'm back with my friend Steven to continue our conversation series. And this one is the one where we talk about the book Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education
hmm
by Jason Brennan and Phillip Magness. And Steven, say hello to the people and tell us a little
Hello.
bit about this book and why we're doing this.
Hello, everyone. So this is back to our ongoing discussion about cracks in the ivory tower. This book is exploring the various ethical issues within education. As I've stated previously, many of us have complained about the ideology that's taught in academia, but this isn't really about that. This is more focusing on some public choice issues as far as how schooling is funded, students having to take classes that they don't want to take, how professors don't want to teach, all these various issues that contribute to the mess in the education system at the moment.
Yeah. And the way we're doing this is by breaking down the book into different chapters and different sections. And this is going to be we're going to be going over chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken
Yes.
here. Is it chapter
hmm
4? But this is going to be the fifth recording that we've had. With our suggestion is to listen to the one where we talked about the 7 big economic insights, the normative business ethic questions, and the descriptive business ethics questions, as these are questions that we took from the book where the author said this is how we're approaching this content. And we think it's important as it's also how we are approaching the content. And these are good things to know about just everything else in general. When it comes to the rest of the content, I don't think you have to listen to them in any particular order, but I think that of any of these would actually help. And it's something similar that we've done in some of our previous conversation
hmm
series,
Right.
in specific the one about critical theory, where we had a separate video defining postmodernism that informed how we were approaching the actual content. Okay,
Sure.
so with that being said, let me read the table of contents and then we'll just try to jump into chapter 4 for this one. So, chapter 1 is neither gremlins nor poltergeists. Number 2 was what the academics really want. Number 3 was why in most academic advertising is immoral bullshit. Number 4 was on reading entrails and student evaluations. Number 5 was grades, communication breakdown. Number 6 was when moral language is a cover for self interest. Number 7, the general education hustle. Number 8, why universities produce too many PhDs. Number 9 was cheaters everywhere. Number 10 is 3 myths about what's plaguing higher education. And number 11 is answer the taxpayers. And then after all, we've done all of these, we'll have one extra one or one more where at least one more where we just kind of have a review of the things that we've discussed and introduce the next book or the next conversation series, which will be on human action by Mises,
hmm
Ludwig von Mises. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's it. One more thing I think I'd like to add before we get into the actual chapter is I think with the importance of this, we're focusing on the higher education in the United States of America, which is talking about 9,500 higher institutions of higher learning that give undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. So this is counting both the private and the public ones. So a lot of these things we'll be discussing the things in that sense, but part of the importance is the world looks at America as the superpower, as, oh, we want what they have there. So they try to copy some of the things that are being done in there. So even developing nations, I know Europe has its own systems, Asia has its own systems, but countries are trying to copy and learn. A lot countries are sent to the United States of America to learn in those institutions. Then they go back to the other countries and they do well in those countries. And people start thinking, oh, it's because of that system. And that government starts putting in the system. And also, we're going through a pandemic right now. And there's been a major pause on a lot of things in the world, including the systems of schooling. And now, with having a sort of reset or a restart of some of these, I think it's a good time to talk about this content and think about this content. So now that we start these things up, should we just carry on the things that we've been doing? Can we try new things? Can we adjust what's going on? And those are the kind of things that I think I have in mind, Stephen has in mind, and I think some of you who are deciding to listen to this, and thank you for that, would also have in mind to this. Okay, so with that being said, if you don't have any more, you can lead us off with chapter 4 on reading entrails and student evaluations.
Sure. All right. Let's jump right in. So I'm going to start off with a quote from the book of Ezekiel. For the king of Babylon will stop at the fork in the road, at the junction of the two roads, to seek an omen. He will cast lots with arrows. He will consult his idols. He will examine the liver. So, how divination rituals do and don't work. So, our authors open with describing I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, Harus Pex reading a liver in an animal to try and figure out what is the weather going to be. They give other examples too. For example, a person trying to read cloud patterns, a person trying to read bird flights, all that. I was thinking, did you ever see Apocalypto, the Mel Gibson movie about the Mayans? Right. Sure. So I think too of when they're looking at the eclipse happening, and of course some of them believe that would be the end of the world, all that. So things like that. Now, many ancient cultures practice these sort of rites. Some still do to this day. Of course, it's not common, but certain remote tribes. So divination, of course, we know in our modern world doesn't work, but they've made the point that it serves a social function, that it sort of binds groups together, and it sort of gives people in power this sort of authority over other people because they can use it to control them. And I was thinking of, in Apocalypto, there's a scene where the eclipse is happening and the priests and the kings sort of smile at each other. And the reason for that is because the Mayans were trained astronomers, so they actually understood how an eclipse was happening. But the general masses thought, oh no, the world is ending. But they knew, okay, good, we can use this to control people. So that's one such example. And some cultures just retain these ideas because just general inertia and tradition. I always think of Fiddler on the Roof with the tradition song and all that. So now, why are we bringing this up? Well, I'll get into this and you'll start to see why. So
that's a good. Sorry, just to break in. That's a good analogy because I think there's a similar thing like that in politics where when it comes around to elections, think about the kids. The kids are the future. If we just get degrees, we get free education, we have the credentials, or we have the most educated voters. They kind of throw that out there. Yet behind the scenes, you have something like that. That scandal that came out with the people paying for influence to get into the university, certain elite people, and it was people from celebrities, from politicians on both sides of the aisle. They understand that it's not really just because you go to university, just because you get the credential doesn't mean you're going to actually get certain things. They know behind the scenes. We know how these things work, and we can use this as a little bauble to kind of trick the people. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you saw, but on Twitter, some of the people are getting roasted because they're talking about the comments from the debate last night about children being smuggled in via coyotes, and some people thought he was talking about the animal. So like David Hogg got accepted into Harvard. He said that everyone, I think you sent me that, right? That was the one you sent me. And then there was another woman who's a corporate lawyer who said the same thing. Everyone's like, wait, you're a corporate lawyer? And I saw Channing Tatum wrote, yeah, it must be an affirmative action hire. And he himself, not Channing Tatum, sorry, Brandon Tatum. It was another. Channing Tatum's an actor, but there was
Tatum. Channing Tatum is an actor.
Yeah, he's an actor. But Brandon Tatum, but he's black, and he's like, oh, must be an affirmative action hire. So it's like things like that, where it's like these are Ivy League or higher up educated people, and it's like they actually thought he literally meant like, oh, children are riding coyotes over the border and stuff.
Okay, with that one again, it's also with the information and the way we take in things, where things come out, and goes to this whole misunderstanding. This goes to the whole thing where when the eclipse happens, people think something due to the different information they have about it. This is one thing I keep saying: is problems occur not because of how we define X, but because of not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. So these people, I think, in general, when they think of immigration, they automatically think of just people coming across, it's with their parents and all these kind of things. They don't have an idea in their mind that encompasses any kind of illegal migration where a situation can be bad enough for you to actually risk sending your child with somebody else or hiring gangsters to actually pay them thousands of dollars and actually get them across the border. And then that happens at the end. That's not something that factors into their mind. So I think when they're thinking about the coyotes, I don't think they actually literally think. It seemed from the wording that at least with one of them, with the state rep, that she might have literally been thinking about the animal itself. But with the hog thing, I'll give him this much of an extent where he specifically said, you're talking about parents, because in his mind, he can't picture any other form of immigration that isn't just like your average family trip across a somewhat dangerous place to kind of go and stay. So in his mind, he's thinking, there are no kids. There's no possible way a child would come across the border unless they had their actual blood relative parents with them.
Yeah.
So in that kind of mentality, if somebody's being referred to as a coyote, he thinks it's a pejorative term about the parents because those are the only people who would possibly have kids. They can't factor in, and that is the weird thing to me
Yeah.
that they can't factor that actual part in, and that's just how with some people they can't factor in that eclipse is not some gods pulling out this thing because that's not it's something that they haven't been taught. Where just the same way the Mayans were controlling the information about what's happening in the world to the people, and then they just trusted that authority. It's the same way that this state rep. It's the same way David Hogg has actually just accepted what's in there, and he's been accepted to this institution of higher learning, which is reaffirming that my mindset. I wouldn't. There's no way this school of Harvard that is so amazing would allow me in if I was this wrong about my perception about the world. So that kind of stuff reinforces the things. It's like there's no possible way that our Mayan civilization would be this successful, and I will be honored to attend this activity unless these rulers were actually right about what portends with the whole like it's so messed up. It's a big aside that we've gone through the start here, but yeah, it's a messed up situation.
Yeah. So the analogy too will make more sense as I continue here. So this chapter, it's all right. It's worth saying. So this chapter gets into performance evaluations, which universities ought to know are deeply flawed. So these are the performance evaluations of the professors from the students. That's what we're going to be focusing on. So they're filled out at the end of each semester. They ask students how much they think they learned, how much they studied, whether the instructor was well prepared, and how valuable the class was overall. So these are actually kind of important because they're used to decide in whom to hire, who to give a raise, who to give tenure, who to promote. Smaller colleges that focus way more on teaching, sometimes entirely, tend to rely on these very heavily. They may even ask for the evaluations along with the cover letter and resume. So by contrast, tenure track faculty tend to be more evaluated by their research output. So if you're going for tenure, they tend to base it off this, whereas this is more you're just teaching, but you want to eventually get to the tenure track or something. So nearly all universities use these. However, the argument is these ultimately fail in tracking teacher performances, hence the divination analogy. These demonstrate teachers' performance about as well as reading entrails or tea leaves. And then the authors say, at least tea leaves would be faster and cheaper anyway. And evidence on this has been accumulating for about the last 40 or so years. They ultimately fail in what they're designed to do, but certain political reasons, such as placating students and giving students the impression they have a say in how their universities are run, are factors in keeping these around. And some of this, too, as we sort of said, is just complacency. Like, we just like the old ways. We've lived this way for a while. We don't want to change things. So that's part of it as well. And as an aside, the authors point out this is not special pleading on their part because they actually have in the chart the graph of their performance reviews. So for Jason, between the fall of 2015 and the fall of 2018, on a scale of 1 to 5, he got between 4.15 and 4.96. So pretty high marks. Phil got from fall of 2013 to fall of 2017, he got 4.16 to 5.0. So they actually got pretty good marks. So they want to make the point that they didn't criticize. They're not criticizing these things because they have some sort of axe to grind. In fact, it would almost make more sense for them to speak positively. But ultimately, they're trying to make the case that no, these do fail at measuring what they're intended to. So, any thoughts or comments on this?
Because it's again just asking what are these things selecting for? Because there's going to be ways to game the system. It's a similar thing as we mentioned with this state rep, as a similar thing as we mentioned with David Hogg getting into Harvard. What is that acceptance actually accounting for? They probably have a calculus in their mind to say, okay, we've already gotten enough people who will be who will achieve a certain amount in actual grades wise to maintain this. So after that, now let's get character people. Let's get these and these people. When it comes to voting, and these people are like, oh, why is this person actually holding this position in life? You're like, oh, should a diversity hire? It could it's also possible that that's not it. It's possible for her to be very capable at being, I think it was something industrial or some kind of industrial patent lawyer. I think it was patent lawyer. It was something like that. I forget the actual thing she was.
I thought she was a corporate lawyer.
Yeah, you could be a very good corporate lawyer because with corporate law, it's about, oh, this case comes up. How good are you at researching the actual information,
Mm.
having a memory about, oh, in this case, I need to go to this and this and remember this and this, and then follow X and Y procedure. That's kind of what the schooling system kind of organizes for. It's very capable, it's very possible that she has achieved that on 100% on merit, but there's nothing at all about that that means that ability to do that transfers into her analysis or awareness about anything in politics. Then people might think, oh, but wait, she's actually a politician. She's actually a local politician. But if you look at universal suffrage in the way that it is, there is nothing about the average voting system or the average voter that selects for people who know more about even just something as basic as the Constitution. So we shouldn't expect her to actually even know any more than she's done about coyotes. Like, what in the media, how much has that actually been covered that these coyote people, these gangs of people actually exist? That has been stuff that has been hushed and removed. If we could somehow see and say, like, look, David Hogg has read this article, these 10 articles, she's read 10 articles covering who the coyotes are, what they actually do, heard actual testimonies from people who've been victimized by these people, and then they still post what they say. Now that is absurd. But we have no reason to expect either Hogg or this one politician to have done those things. So that's the kind of thing, and that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. What are those things selecting for? Like, why would we expect just because somebody has a 5.0 rating has somehow selects that they're excellent at taking X information and giving to these people, or are they just very good at gaming the system and convincing the students that they're in a positive environment? Because take something like horoscopes, as we were talking about with the divinations. Like, how many other things in your life, in people's lives, do they actually decide on horoscopes? How many people do you know that decide major things in their life based on horoscopes? How many people would you trust if they told you that what they decided to teach you that day, what they decided to sell you, what they decided to do with you is based off of a horoscope that they read? And then what if you knew that this person wasn't actually of that horoscope? There's so many things to go in there. So it's kind of just like we need a better idea of why we decide things and how confident we are that this is an actual system. If we care about educating people, if we care about information, if we care about school, why are we confident that this is the current system that has selected for the best kind of environment for this thing to occur? Yeah.
Well, I also think that Cook from Harvard, who I told you about, like, we used to always make fun of him because he's kind of like what we're describing with these people, where like I remember he would do his knife cuts. He would actually pull out like a ruler or tape measure and measure the actual like dices of things. And I remember it was funny because when I went to culinary school, they told me, they're like, don't do that in the kitchen. You'll get laughed out of the kitchen. And then I told them about this and they're like, I'm sorry, but this guy worked at a retirement home and he was like obsessing over the exact precision of his knife cuts. And
Yeah.
it's like, and it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I respect your attention to detail, but it's like in an industrial kitchen, you can't sit there and like, I mean, if you go to French Laundry or something, yeah, they would expect that. But at the same time, you have to have a certain level of competency to even work there. So if you work in like a more casual place, they're not going to sit there and do that. Then I remember like we had this roast beef dish and he was actually doing like math in his head about how many slices of beef each guest would get. Like if each person gets 5 slices, it'll be this. If each person gets 3 slices, it's this. And he's just going on and on. And then my boss goes, if you overanalyze anymore, my head is going to explode. And it's just like, but he was one of those people that we're describing. Like he spoke Russian fluently. I think he might've spoken other languages as well, like very book smart, but you put him into that like hands-on kind of environment where he has to think on the fly. He can't do it. So I think it's that kind of,
And it's a strange thing how this thing works, because I might be able to sit here and talk to you for hours about different mangas and stuff that I've read, but why would anybody expect that to translate over to me having knowledge about medicine? But someone's like, oh, that person is really amazing doctor, so that means they're going to be really good at this other unrelated thing. Like, no, those things shouldn't transfer that way. We should have a better judgment system to understand why somebody qualified to actually do this. And I think specifically with politics, it's in part due to that universal suffrage thing. Because if we start actually saying that, no, people's awareness of politics is not the same, it's very hard to keep supporting something like universal suffrage, where you say, oh, just if you're this age and you happen to be in this location or born in this location, that's enough for you to vote. We start questioning that because we realize that people's aptitudes are not quite, it's not quite that even, not quite that equal.
And the horoscopes thing is just really funny to me because, like, I don't know if this has always been happening or I just noticed it, but I keep laughing at these women who are like, "Oh, I believe in science, climate change, blah blah blah." But then it's like, this is Sagittarius season, this is Leo season because it's like none of this stuff is established by science. I know I keep harping about this point, but it's so amusing to me because it's like science, science, science. I believe in science. I believe in science, and then they post this stuff. It's like none of this stuff is rooted in science. These are just old mythological relics of Greece. I mean, maybe Egypt too.
It's an odd thing because
Yeah.
even where does that come from? I think it predates. Like we talked about the industrial schooling system. We've talked about this in the previous videos. And industrial schooling system is the experiment. A
Yeah.
lot of things that are done in there, people might think, oh, if we didn't have the schooling system, we wouldn't have this. But something like compartmentalization, there's a reason why school is compartmentalized like that. Is because that is an atypical thing humans have been able to do. So they're trying to take advantage of the human mind to do that. Because otherwise, why would somebody not realize that you can go to math class? They have that experience. Most kids were not good across the board. Some kids were really good at physical education. Some kids were really good at biology. Some kids are really good at English. Some kids are really good at the math or something. And then that didn't translate across the board. Yet when they come to regular life, in some cases, they want to transfer that aptitude into all other parts. Or they want to say like, oh, because this person was bad at this other thing means I can't trust him on this one thing. You know, like, oh, look, Trump had a bankruptcy, so it means he sucks at this. I'm like, no, that's neither here nor there. There's so many other things that go into that. Oh, Joe Biden has like slipped up on this, so that means he's not capable of doing this. No, Joe Biden might be very capable of this. Even that slip up you think might have been something intentional for various other reasons. So that is one thing that we need to stop. We just need better ways of actually reviewing and understanding things. Yeah.
And even my post recently about James Lindsay, about my friend Tony said something about like, oh, how did he not know this? And I said, James Lindsay isn't really good on economics. I mean, obviously I have tremendous respect for the guy. I post a lot of his stuff. We did a whole video series on his book, but I don't think he's well-versed on economics. And again, I'm not saying this like, oh, he's stupid or anything. It's no, he likely lived in that academic echo chamber. He heard the usual, oh, the government has to step in to do this and all that. And I guarantee you, he's never read Rothbard. He's never read Mises, all that. And again, this isn't like, oh, he's stupid. Like, I'm sure if he read it, he would say, okay, this kind of makes sense, or I see where these people are coming from. It's just he hasn't delved into that area. And yeah, obviously, brilliant man. I mean, he has degrees in math and physics. I can't do that. I mean, I definitely acknowledge he's a brilliant guy, but that doesn't mean that he's strong in all these areas or that even he's well versed in all these areas. So I think it's worth taking that into consideration when you're weighing someone's judgment.
Yeah, and that does happen. Even just think about yourself.
Yeah.
Do you know the same information that you knew yesterday? Do you know the same information that you knew 10 years ago? Do you know the same information that you knew when you were 5? And do you have the same exact mindset that you did during those all those different times? And you still are a different person. There's very few things I think people can think of. There's some base principles and foundational type of things like that to where you can say, okay, these are things that I build my worldview on. But there's a lot of subjective things that you can probably imagine 2 or 3 things that if you found out 1 or 2 of the things that you thought about this one thing were wrong, you would change your mind on this. Or if you can imagine like, okay, if this was proven to be true about this other thing that I disagree with, then I would accept that. So those are things that are constantly happening. And that's something I agree with. And again, I think it's a good time to mention that with our critique of this, we're not saying that the people involved in it, as we talked about in the Neither Gremlins Nor Poltergeist, which I think was a good one to start off with this book with, was establishing that we're not saying these are evil people. In fact, we're saying that these people mean well, which is why we think it's important to read this content and make a book like this, because we think, or make a series of conversations like this, because we think a lot more people are actually trying to do good, and they're just not able to actually achieve it because they're using tools and means that are not necessarily, that are suboptimal, and we can do much better than that with the good intentions that we actually have to actually achieve.
Yeah. Definitely, yes. All right, so moving on here, we're going to talk a bit about reliability and validity. So we use these terms sort of interchangeably, but in science, they have precise meanings. So reliable means that something gets consistent results when it's used. Like, so for example, what they use is a thermometer. So reliable, let me point out here, though, does not always mean correct. So for example, water boils at 212. If a thermometer always says it boils at 200, technically that thermometer is reliable because it always hits it at that same mark, but it's not correct,
Yeah.
meaning the thermometer is miscalibrated. If it hits 212 each time, that means it's reliable and correct. But reliable means it keeps getting that result regardless. So valid means it measures the things it's supposed to measure. So for example, you can't use a scale. If a scale measures your height but not your weight, well, it's not a scale, it's not valid. Or if you use something that's meant for measuring height but it measures weight, that's not a valid measurement device. So
Okay.
ideally a good test should include both these things. It should be reliable and it should be valid as well. So student evaluations as they're currently done, the authors argue, are reliable but not valid. They keep determining certain things, but they don't measure what they're intended to. So instructors seem to get the same results in the same courses year after year, but they don't actually measure effective teaching, which I'm going to get into here. So the argument here is that let's see here. The argument here isn't just that performance evaluations are invalid, but it's immoral for universities to use them because they're invalid. So the authors argue they violate two major ethical obligations. One, an obligation to faculty to evaluate them based on fair and reasonable criteria, and an obligation to students to use fair and reasonable criteria in determining who their teachers will be. And then they give an analogy, like let's say we have the Joe the plumber, the stereotype. If you were to evaluate him fairly, it would be on things like, does he show up on time? Does he get the work done effectively? Does he have good customer service skills? Does he work in an efficient manner? Does he not overcharge, et cetera, et cetera? I think we can sort of figure out, okay, how most workers would be evaluated. So let's say now it's time for Joe's performance evaluation. Let's say Joe's boss, Mike, did any of these. Number one, Joe, time to determine if you get a raise. I will shake my magic 8-ball to decide. It says no, you shouldn't. Number two, Joe, stand on this bathroom scale and I'll decide if you have an acceptable BMI and that will determine your raise. No, it's not. You don't get a raise. Number three, Joe, you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat. You don't get a raise. Number four, Joe, I'm planning to replace you with Sally because she's so hot. So it's, of course, you see all the problems here. This doesn't actually measure whether Joe is a good worker or not. So a good manager, of course, sets objective standards. Things like looks and views may matter in certain cases. Obviously, if you're hiring for modeling or something, yeah, looks would matter. But of course, as we know here in the cases of students or manual labor like this, no, they don't. So also, we'd add here that products are generally bought and sold with prior expectations. For example, if you order food, you know you have to pay for it. When someone hires you for a job, you know that you have to do certain tasks as a part of that job. So in the case of Joe the plumber, if he's fixing a pipe and notices another problem, it falls on him to say something about it. Then the owners will have to decide, do we want to pay for this? But he has to forewarn them. Bear in mind, this will cost you more and take time. It's sort of an unwritten rule that people know. That way, it's not he does all of this, then they get a huge bill at the end. I know this is always an issue with mechanics where they overcharge for certain things. So they try to train people to say, okay, just so you know, we found these other issues. How would you like to proceed? And then if the person says no and something happens, it's on them. But if they say yes, then they know what they're getting charged for. So that's sort of an unwritten rule. Now, there might be exceptions to this. Like, for example, certain bloggers who've come into my job, they've gotten things for free because what it is that we're gifting them food, but they have thousands or tens of thousands of followers. So the idea is that it's sort of an investment for the restaurant. Okay, they get free food, but then thousands or tens of thousands of people see their professional photos and reviews, and then they'll come to the restaurant and that'll make us more money. So there are exceptions to this, but again, those things are decided in advance. Another example they bring up here is that a small business might promote a certain friend or family member to a managerial role, but of course, if they're professional, they'll warn people in advance. And then if a person gets passed up for promotion, at least they sort of will understand why. Again, we can get into the ethics of that, but if they're professional, at least they know the reason for it. So professors are hired with background expectations and mutual understandings as well, which of course again vary from school to school. So an academic manager should evaluate employees based on valid measures of relevant employee excellence. But of course, again, does that always happen? And I think I sort of talked to you, Silas, about this off the camera, but we were saying how I worked in a place where there was always some relationship going on between a manager and either another manager or an employee. And I remember when I started there, so there were three managers in this place. There was the food service director, there was the executive chef, and the dining room manager. And when I started there, it turned out that the dining room manager and the food service director were in a relationship, but like I didn't know about this till later. And it was kind of funny because the dining room manager was actually a cook who had gotten promoted, which I thought was kind of strange because typically the dining room manager is a server who got promoted or someone hired from outside. And then I, as a stupid teenager, asked, "Why'd you get the dining room manager job?" And one of my coworkers was like, "Well, I was banging the boss." And then it was fun. It was funny because then their friends were like, after the fact, were like, "Oh well, their relationship didn't start until after she got promoted. Oh, he was already separated from his wife, all that." And I was like, I don't know. That seems a little suspicious to me. and then and then there was another case down the road when I worked there when the chef and this cook had a relationship and like everyone sort of knew about it because of like the way they acted around each other. Like she would slack off and like he wouldn't say anything, but then anyone else would, like they'd get yelled at. And then it was funny because there was this area where people would park and people would hang out and smoke weed after work. And there were a few times where people hung out late and smoked weed and they came out and then they saw her come out of the kitchen. Everyone's like, "What are you still doing here?" She's like, "Oh, nothing. What are you guys still doing here?" And then they would start to leave and then they would see the boss come out a few minutes later. It's like, okay, everyone knows something's going on here. And then she started bragging about it to different people. She said to all these different people, she'd be like, "I'm telling this only to you. We did it on his desk. We did it on the other
Oh,
manager's desk. We did all this stuff." And then the thing was, he actually wanted, when the boss above him was leaving, he actually applied for his job and he was actually hoping to get that job and then promote her to his position. But someone went and said something to the lady running the place and they both got fired. So yeah, these things do happen. I mean, this is the real world, and it's something I've sort of struggled with too because it's one of those things where like ideally you don't want this to happen, but it's like, look, people are people. People will do these things. Now, companies do have rules against this. Like I know where I work now, of course, managers are not allowed to date employees, but also even if employees date other employees, they have to actually fill out paperwork because it's saying things like, "I'm not going to bring this into work. I'm not going to let this impact my job," all that. So it used to be in this, at least in food service, anything went kind of, but now they've gotten stricter because of Me Too and other things. And also corporations just in general, like I remember telling someone when that chef who was sleeping with the cook, when he got fired, it wasn't like, oh, he cheated on his wife. It's no, she was an employee, he was a manager. Like if he had a relationship with someone in another
yeah.
department, if he had a relationship with someone in another department, the upper management doesn't care because it's like, oh, it doesn't affect your job. But it gets into the issue of, even if it's consensual, it's like, well, of course, again, she'll get special treatment. If she gets a raise or a promotion, people wonder that's why. And then even if she wasn't 100% on board, like let's say he was just sort of coercing her to go along with it, well, then it's ambiguous because then she may feel pressured, like, uh-oh, my job's under fire if I don't do this. And then if she were to say anything, he could retaliate by firing her. So it creates that very uncomfortable dynamic. And unfortunately, again, it's like, I think companies are doing a better job of rooting that out, but we still haven't figured out an ideal way. And again, part of it's just human nature. People fall in love. These things happen. Any
Yeah.
comments on all of this? Or
Yeah, it goes to the thing where workplace dynamics are human dynamics
yeah.
because you're still dealing with a human animal being put in certain places, and when it comes down to it, civilization itself is a social construct because it's about how we socialize in a civil way. We decide, okay, we happen to be in this area, or we choose to be in this area, or we find ourselves here, and we're going to interact with each other. So how do we do it in a civil way, in a civilized way? And I think that's how you build civilizations, where you can socialize and be very, very anti-civil, very uncivil. Like you could just come in there and just start assaulting people, or you could just throw it around, or there's ways they could have done it to be more underground with it. But this is a common thing that I think you see, and we see it at certain levels where you wonder, how could somebody at that position do what they did?
Yeah.
Like the alleged things that, that the son of the child of the current Democratic presidential candidate is accused of having done. it's people wonder, why would you do that? Why would you leave that there with that person and do this? It must be some kind of conspiracy. But no, like,
No.
people don't. What makes you think they in a position where that would be out of the range of possibilities for them to do? Because when you actually start thinking about it, someone thinks, why would this person be in this relationship? Why would they decide to engage in these relations inside the actual workplace? And then at that point, after deciding to get into the relationship, deciding to engage in intercourse several times within the office space and things like that, you're only surprised that they decide to tell more than one person. Like, like, for most people, for many people, they wouldn't have decided to even get into the relationship to begin with.
Yeah.
For most people, many people, in just the way we think of the world the way it is today, we wouldn't even need the rules and the laws and to write the papers down to say, oh, if we're working together, we have to fill out these things. For most people, you might think this is superfluous. This is, I already know, it's common sense to me. But it's not that common. It's
No,
probably
no.
likely in the past there was a lot more things getting closer to that kind of lion type of environment where you just roll in the lion, the male lion rolls in the pride, just kills all the kids and all the cubs and kittens and things like that. And then the mother of those cubs and kittens, they don't object. They're just like, yeah, whatever. You won. You beat the old alpha male, so you can kill my kids, and then now I'll have kids with you. Like, those are the practicalities of nature and life that we're coming from. We got to realize these advancements and these civilizations and these things, even the systems of schooling, the systems of passing on information, these are things very unique to humans. And nothing we're doing now is something that we're going to be like, this is how we're going to be doing it forever. And my favorite genre is of things to read and intake is like the hard sci-fi, going to like the epic space opera type of stuff, things going into the extreme future with advancements in technology that we can hardly think of and things like this. And then you have certain structures that are very similar to today. And I'm like, why do you think that would still continue that much in the future with all these
Yeah.
other kind of environments that are out? You know, that kind of thing, like, where it's like we're ignoring the things that's selected for us to do the things that we're doing now, and thinking if you changed all those things, we would still be doing these things, and that's not quite the case.
We'll get more. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So we'll get more into it on chapter 6 about how language disguises how people. The chapter 6 is the one that cites the elephant in the brain, that book, and it talks about how we sort of we've sort of evolved to follow rules in order to cooperate, but we find ways to rationalize bending or breaking those rules a bit to act in our self-interest. So, for example, like with these managers I described, they know that they're not supposed to be doing this. I mean, some of them were married, but in their own mind, it's, oh, well, nobody's going to know. Oh, well, we'll do it after work. They won't be around. Oh, people find ways to sort of bend or break those rules in order to advance their self-interest. And again, we evolved to do that. So it's not specific to these people. It's just how we are. Like, and again, the same, it applies to other things. Like I say, like people in certain workplaces, like, oh, I'll take a little bit of alcohol, even though I'm not supposed to. Oh, it's, again, it's how we evolved. We evolved to follow rules in order to be cohesive, but we also evolved to sort of bend or break those rules for self-interest. But we also evolved to sort of come down on people who break those rules, because that's how we keep the group together. So all these things, when you look at it from that perspective, all kind of make sense. So we'll get more into that on chapter 6, but I just thought I'd mention it here. Sure.
And then this is another concern I have with the frequency of these things, because there's many steps that happen with this. What if he'd only told one person? What if they'd only had relations in the office place once by mistake? And what if they had been doing this thing secretive? There's ways where there's a chance there could be at least twice or 3 times or 4 times the amount of people that we find out about doing these things. Like when it comes to the political thing I mentioned earlier, I'm not surprised by that. I think there's a lot more people involved in politics who do a similar thing, and not just in politics, in their own sphere, to look out for their kids and do this. This is something that I talked about way back when George Bush had become president, and I was thinking, well, people were saying, oh, he just became president because his dad was president. But I'm thinking this happens a lot. If your dad is a butcher, owns a butcher shop, and then the kid comes up, he loves the kid, loves his child. The kid comes up and tries these different things and isn't really that effective at it, but the father is involved. This is my blood. This is my flesh and blood. I got grandkids. I'm carrying on my genes. they will do what it takes to give them the right
Yeah.
connections, to meet the right sellers, to you can hire this space, you can come learn, and I'll give you inside, and then they'll run the butcher shop. And then not too many people are like, oh, that's what's that term?
Nepotism.
Yeah, they won't be like, oh, that's nepotism. The only reason that guy is running that butcher shop is because his dad. And like, yeah, it could be a primary reason, but people don't object so much to that. People don't say, I'm not going to do that for my own kids. So the only difference there, the primary difference was instead of his father owning a butcher shop, his father ran the most powerful country in the world.
Yeah.
So George Bush kind of snuck in there in some way, and that played a part to that. And it's a similar thing with the current presidential candidate from the Democrats. I truly think he cares for his son.
Yeah.
There are some issues that are in there that could be, if proven to be true, could be problematic. But I don't think he was doing it from a bad place. Just like I think people who send their kids to schools are doing it for positive reasons. They look at the different evaluations of the students out there and they think, oh, this school is rating well for this. So we're assuming that this school is selecting well because we think they're going to educate our kids. And then look at all these happy kids that have come out from it and they're earning this money. They somehow evaluate that is what this environment is. And even the kids themselves, once they graduate, they say, oh, I loved my time at school. It was a great time at school. I really enjoyed it. But what they could be evaluating could not actually be the education itself. It could be something with the environment. It could be something with being around people your age, finding that person you love. And there's things in that we're saying, try to take that apart.
Yeah.
Try to focus on the environment, because we might think the best system would actually to still maintain the college campus type environment. But instead of saying you're in there in order to actually be taught, learn grades in this system, take the schooling part, take the information education part out of it, and you just have something like that, but people work, but learn in a different way, learn the information in a different kind of structure, but you still maintain the environment of the sports teams, of the camaraderie, going to parties, of living in dorms. I think some of those things are still positive, but those things don't have to be connected to saying this is the only way people can learn information.
Yeah, okay. Definitely. So just a few more points before we move on. I always laugh too at this place where I was describing these affairs. One of my friends, her first day, she actually went into the dry storage and went into a crouton box and actually found a condom wrapper inside. And she just wondered, like, okay, what kind of place is this? And then, of course, all this stuff came out later. Also, one of the office chairs, let's just say, had a stain on it. And they actually threw it out after these two got fired. Oh, it's so bad. And then I wanted to say, too, again, I'm not going to mention names here, but at CIA, some of this stuff happened, too. Like, for example, there was a certain older chef who they knew he liked good looking girls, and they did an experiment where towards the end of class, you each have to make something and you present it to the chef. So what they did was they made soup, but they all took from the same pot and they different people presented the same soup, and they found that good looking girls actually got higher marks, but it was the same pot of soup. So these things happen. And again, this is considered the top culinary school. And it's like, people can say like, oh, you're being harsh or whatever. But I'm like, you can ask other people. They'll tell you they saw this sort of stuff too. But again, because of the power dynamics, it gets tough because do students go and complain to the administration? Because to them, it's, well, we have new students every 3 weeks. What do we care? We're not going to come down hard on someone who's been teaching here for decades. And then if, of course, the teacher finds out that those students said something, well, then they're going to fail or something like that. And also with teachers moving around, rather, that can impact those students down the road, because then if they get that teacher again, that teacher is going to know, okay, this person went to my bosses and said something, they're going to retaliate. And then the reverse is true too. Like when I took my practicals, both before my internship and at the end, I actually had two chefs who both liked me. So that definitely worked in my favor. Like I remember this one chef is like, I'm going to give you a generous grade here, but please work on these things. So again, I lucked out. If I had someone who was really strict, I might've gotten a lower grade. And then towards the end, it was the same thing. The guy's like, oh, you're a smart guy, I'm going to ask you some tough questions, all that. But again, it's like I lucked out both times. So again, I've benefited from this sort of thing as well, but it's human nature, and it's like it's a hard thing to get around. That's my point. And then the other thing I thought about with your example with the lions is they said that female chimpanzees actually will deliberately mate with different males, so the male doesn't know which kids are his. So that way he's less likely to kill those kids off because those could be his. So there's things like that too, which are it's brutal, yeah.
Yeah, nature is quite the thing. I would say I think it's complicated. I don't think
Yeah.
it's convoluted
Yeah.
because it might seem convoluted, but it's rather practical of why it follows. It follows a kind of known system of why the things happen. You might see something like, oh, why is that? But then that's the magnificent thing I've found when you look into evolution, evolutionary biology, evo psych. Like you look at the way things grow, organisms grow, and some of these things make sense. And that's one of the things that to me has just helped me, just learning more information. That's why I'm very interested in this topic, is because I think we're doing people a disservice where if they were learning information in better ways, the world would be better for it. Them and the world would be better for it because the world is built by humans interacting in more positive ways, and that just leads to human flourishing, which is good for me. It's good for Stephen. It's good for you guys listening, you guys, gals, and everything else in the middle. And the future, whether we have kids or not, it's a positive thing to actually have more information and more awareness and more accurate understanding of what reality actually is and can be. But yeah, that was one thing. Oh, you just again with that question, we're talking about certain specific places, and I think we talked about this more in the You Are What You Consume series, where this is a general question. People are in different fields and different things, and it's just human beings. Does anyone think there's particular fields that select for people that get into more issues like this? I had one particular story. Just an anecdotal thing is, a friend of mine was a bouncer at a strip club, a rather famous strip club in the San Francisco area. That was my first time actually going to one of those kind of locations, and I actually hung out with him after and met some of the people that he worked with. And it was just we just went to a diner after, just chilling and talking and just seeing the workplace dynamics. And it's like, yes, they work in a place in the sex industry, and it's the customers might be different. It got to start thinking like, what is the product? What are the interactions? And they were talking about the same complaints that you'd hear about managers and customers and work times. And I could imagine just the different interactions between the people. Do they have the inside kind of dynamics, or this person is hooking up with this person? Like, does that change really so much depending on the field? And from that experience, it kind of made me think where it's like, take out the actual job place, what's actually being sold, the product, and it's still just people interacting in different ways. Take out the fact that, oh, it's the president and the politics in the United States of America. Why is that so much different than the politics in China? Why is that so much different than the politics in Kenya? Why is that so much different in the politics in your own family, in your own small little sections? And you'll realize that maybe it's not so much different. Yeah.
Well, I was going to sort of add on to that. I think I mentioned in a previous video, like my dad talked about his experience at IBM, like people sleeping with their secretaries, all that. And these are people with masters, maybe even PhDs. So it's like, they're not above this stuff. And then that article, I think I've sent it to you, about why regulatory agencies fail. The guy talks about oil executives having relationships with people in regulatory agencies, people doing cocaine at holiday parties. I mean, people are people. It's like, it doesn't, you can work for government, you can have all these degrees. People are people at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So moving on. So going back to things like the Joe the plumber's performance evaluation, Joe's boss Mike has to correct for polluting factors, to use their term. So, for example, if Joe is the only black employee and the customers are all white and he gets bad reviews, he has to investigate that. If he finds that the customers give black workers in general bad reviews, okay, it's worth investigating, sending them to different people, or deciding, do I want these people to continue as customers? Ideally, you have to find some way to sort of take out these polluting factors. When I did performance evaluations at my job, we talked about this as well. Like, you have to sort of, you may have certain personal opinions on people, but you have to just talk strictly about their work. Again, you can love the people, hate them, whatever, but it's how are they as a worker? That's all you're supposed to evaluate. And in my job, I think what was good is because a few managers were doing it together, we all sort of keep each other in check, so we can weigh, okay, how many times was this person late? Is this person regularly on time? How does this person perform during service? Like, we can sort of correct each other to, keep our biases in check. So the big problem here, of course, is how do we operationalize and measure teaching effectiveness? We have to really be clear on what we're measuring. Well, again, what does it mean to be a good or bad teacher? These things ultimately can be sort of subjective and hard to measure because, for example, a student may be strict. A teacher may be strict and students may learn a lot, but then in return, students may punish them with a low performance evaluation. And you may have the opposite where teachers are really easy and students like that, but are they really learning much? They may not be. And then Jason has a story here. He talks about a colleague, let's call him Bob, who teaches business ethics. He asks students to assess how morally good they are. They generally believe themselves to be good, and they would only act badly if stressed, unprepared, or unaware. In the end, he gives them a journal assignment, and the majority end up cheating on it, not because of the reasons they laid out. So he's teaching them an important lesson. They're subject to the same corruption as anyone else. But then Bob's students, in turn, get mad at him and give him a low performance evaluation. So again, you could say even for a valuable lesson, he still gets low marks just because it's not what they want to hear. So that's tough. Let's see here. Of course, the best way is to measure how much students learn, but this is tough. So I think I sort of touched on this last time, but like, let's say how a bad teacher does with MIT kids versus, again, Keene State kids. So MIT kids on an average have higher IQs, better study habits, better conscientiousness, etc. But there's a teacher who's not that good. The authors would argue, and as would we, I think, that the better students are able to sort of make up the difference because they're smart enough where they can learn on their own. They're self-starters. They can sort of bridge those gaps, whereas the students who aren't as diligent, maybe not as smart, it's going to be tougher for them. But then the reverse is true too. If you have someone who's really good at teaching, who can read each student, make things learnable for each student, well, if they have students that aren't as good, they're going to sort of bridge the gap that way. So it gets sort of tough. And then how do you measure how good are they at doing these things? How smart are the students? How hardworking are the students? It gets kind of into murky territory. Yeah. So then we could give variables for these. So, for example, give students the final and the first and last days of class, independently measure students' abilities to see how they do to isolate the effects of the professor, assign students materials from different courses. But according to these authors, colleges don't do this. So they're not very rigorous in their methodology. Most SETs, we're just going to call them student evaluations, SETs, don't actually measure how much students learn. At most, they ask how much they think they learned. Any thoughts or comments on this so far?
Yeah, this one reminds me a bit of something I think it was James Lindsay might have mentioned this when he was talking about the incident, the whole thing that happened at Evergreen State University, which was where Brett Weinstein and Heather Haying, his wife, were teaching, and that was, I think, one of the things that really catapulted some of this critical theory in universities onto at least an American-wide scale and a global scale to a more extent of it. And he was talking about how it wasn't necessarily the content alone, but it was the enabling of using these kind of systems where they had this kind of student evaluation system where the students were allowed to decide how they were being taught, what they were being taught. Yeah. They were the ones completely evaluating. Instead of, I'm not saying it should just be on one end, where in my experience of being in schools here in Kenya, there's not that much of there's a fear, there's an outright palpable fear of the students to the teachers. Now, that could be more due to the environments. That is definitely in part due to the fact that from my personal experience and my current knowledge, I do know that there's still corporal punishment in schools, like kneel on the corner, get your fingers beaten with sticks, people being beaten with different implements, grabbing things from the curtains, and just there's still regular beatings. So that's a common thing. So you start building that dynamics, you add the societal dynamics, so you just have to respect your elders. So it's not a conducive environment in that one end. But then on the inverse, you had what happened at Evergreen, where the kids just kind of went roughshod on the school, and that just slowly by slowly started crumbling any actual system, any civilized way, any civil way to actually achieve the goals of an institution of learning. And I think that's a similar thing where if you have an institution where kids are so afraid of their teachers, like from my experience where I ask them, do you guys understand this lesson? And then they all say yes, because I don't know if they're used to just not being asked, or if they feel by saying no, it would be something I would take as a judgment on me, then I would hold it against them. Then the assignment comes and it's clear that they didn't answer it because maybe 1 out of the 10 students actually even did the basics of the assignment because they weren't understanding just some simple things. So that's something that's on one end. And then the inverse, it's, oh, you can't ask me. I just know I should do this. So let's just stick with the horoscope. I'm just sticking with that. about how you evaluate things, what you consider to be actually a valid way of actually structuring something. Imagine if you went to a university and they're like, okay, this is a horoscope university. We're going to choose when you sign up by horoscopes, your dorms by horoscopes, your diet by horoscopes, your major by horoscopes. Oh, only Scorpios can only learn from Cancers. So those are the only people together. Like you're only allowed to deal with these people. All the teams on sporting teams are decided via horoscopes. At the end of the day, like we're going to decide your grades not because of what you actually put in, but via horoscopes. So the teacher is going to read their horoscope today, and through that, they're going to devise on the way of like grading all these things. Would anyone actually consider that to be something that is a valid way of actually running an institution? I don't think they would, even the people who completely read their horoscopes on a day-to-day basis. So that's just about understanding different forms of evaluating different content and what is the best way and better ways of doing things and achieving that level of achieving the goals that we're all interested in actually achieving.
Well, and also to add on to that too, some of this changes with maturity. Like, for example, I had this French teacher in school who was really tough, and it was one of those things where a lot of people complained about her, but then they look back and they're like, we learned more from her than probably anyone else. And then there were other teachers who were fun and easygoing, but then you look back, you're like, I don't remember anything I was taught in that class. So there's that too. But then with my French teacher, it was interesting because like I thought about it more later, and I was talking to a friend about this. Like, she was just a no bullshit kind of person. Like, study, pay attention. She because the classes were small, she knew if you weren't paying attention, she'd call on you. She wasn't afraid to call you out in front of other students. So she made sure you paid attention. She would give feedback. She was tough, but again, it's like she was trying to prepare people. She's like, look, if you go to a college, especially a better one, they're going to expect this from you. And that's what she was trying to prepare people for. So you look back, if more teachers were like that, ultimately we'd be a lot better off. But at the time as a teenager, you're like, oh, she's just being mean. So there's that angle too.
Yeah.
So mathematician Phil, sorry, go ahead.
I just think, like a simple thing I think we can all agree on is there should be, I guess they do the whole thing where you can go and you can visit a college, you can do this, but then just think about your average 17-year-old, your average 16 to 18-year-old. Do people really think that that average 16 to 18-year-old can be taken to a university or do a university visit and have a good enough idea about where they want to spend the next 4 years of their life?
Yeah.
That is something that I think, why not take a year off or take some time? What is that about the American system that makes people feel it has to be directly after K through 12, directly into the university system? That's one thing that I'm not quite sure. And that's something that is duplicated in other places. And some other places I can understand where it's just like, oh, we need to get this person, we need money from this person. But then it's different. I think in part due to the whole ability that it's been subsidized by the government so much of these public institutions, like we just saw, we talked about in the last video with Harvard is $73,000 or something like that a year, but after the grants that your average student has, grants and scholarships and things like that, it comes down to like $15,000, which is actually less than what Keene State is after grants and all those things, which is $18,000. So that's the kind of thing where maybe people think, okay, since we don't really have to pay right now, we don't really have to be that solid about the decision that we're making. But it's just, I just feel people are very unprepared going into that system. And even if you're saying parents are involved, but on average, your parents, how much time have your parents actually spent with the child to understand this is my child's abilities? Haven't they been K through 12 for those at least 12 years? What if you take a year off, you shadow your parents at whatever it is they're doing and get to understand them better? There's so many other ways of doing these things that I'm thinking are just, it's upsetting. It's unfortunate.
To sort of add on to this, I think of Walter Williams talking about going back to college later. Like, I think he went to the Army and then went back later, and he actually said, he's like, I'm glad I did. He's like, if I had went to college out of high school, I would have been a disaster. He's like, I had no discipline. I was fooling around. But by that time, I was an adult. And I think it was Charles Murray who was actually saying that they've studied this, like people who go through the military then go to college actually do well because they have the maturity, they have the discipline, they take things seriously. So they're mature adults ready to handle the work, and they work hard versus, okay, these are kids who just want to party, sleep around, all that. And it's going to produce a much different kind of education. And then the other thing too is I've had these sort of debates about the quality of the CIA where I went with my mother, where she'll always say things like, "Oh, it's a nice school," but then I'm like, "What are you basing that off of?" And I'm like, "You're basing it off of the previous reputation, and you like eating there." And I'm like, "Yeah, I had a lot of fun when I was. I had a lot of fun when I was there. I like the restaurants, all that. But you didn't go there, work in the industry, and sort of weigh, okay, what did I learn there? How did it translate? Like, it's kind of hard to measure those things unless you're actually in it. That's the whole point. Yeah." Like, I mean, yeah, I had fun when I was there. Yeah, it's a nice campus. Yeah, they have great restaurants. But does that mean that you got a great education? Is it worth what you pay? No. And then she'll say things to me like, well, a lot of people learn on the job and all that. But I'm like, but again, this gets to the fundamentals of what we're talking about. Why pay all that money if you're going to learn it at work anyway? It's no.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so moving on, mathematician Philip Stark and education researcher Richard Freistadt raised another concern. Students are often asked to rate their professors on effectiveness, class preparation, helpfulness, etc., on a 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 scale. The problem is that these numbers are not cardinal values, but rather stand for verbal descriptions like ineffective, somewhat ineffective, very effective, etc. You could replace those numbers with just the descriptions themselves, and they wouldn't tell you much. So the universities then calculate the averages of the professors based on these, but this runs into other issues, like, for example, students not clearly defining the difference between 1 and 2 and the like. If a group of large students has scores that go from 1 to 5, it's hard to make sense of that. A mean score is kind of incoherent. So you could have that really tough teacher. Some students say, "Oh, I like him, he prepared me," and then they give a high mark. Someone else said, "No, he's mean, I give him a low mark." You could have that teacher who is fun, and then students say, "Oh, I like them a lot," give them a 5. People say, "No, I didn't learn anything," they gave me a 1. And I saw this at culinary school too. There were teachers who had there were students who had different opinions of chefs based on those things as well. And again, like I said, there's also favoritism. Like, you have a chef who likes you a lot, they're going to be nicer, you may give them a better mark. So that becomes kind of incoherent. But then at the same time, students use all these measurements in regard to hiring, promotion, etc. But from what the authors can tell, they haven't really delved into how meaningful are these really. And then the people who hold these up as good evaluations, it's, well, you bear the burden of proof. It's basically that old political thing of, we need to do something. This is something. Let's do this. But the people who hold up student evaluations, they don't appear to make the case for why these are effective. So again, we may as well read tea leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have this. I mean, people. They could be something like that also with this identity politics, where people try to break out to that because you spend so much time being schooled and being put in this kind of factory environment that, hey, teacher, please, like, hey, teacher, well, no, what is it? We don't need. I know that's like the Pink Floyd song. What do they say?
We don't need no education.
Yeah,
leave those
but what
kids,
is
teacher,
hey,
leave those kids alone.
Leave those kids. Yeah, I think there is a part of that where we take these people with these different ideas, and then we mash them in certain systems and say, you have to conform, you have to be the same. And then I think there might be some kind of backlash of that, where people are like, no, we're actually unique. We're these unique little snowflakes or something,
yeah.
or we're going to, I am this, I'm trying to identify myself in this group. And they feel, there might be an aspect where some of the heavily schooled people seem to want to appeal to this definition group so much because they've been somehow indoctrinated into thinking you have to fit these certain molds instead of just existing in yourself. I don't know. It's a tough kind of situation, because if they truly understood the diversity of the people, then why would they be so defensive and supportive of systems that just think, oh, you can just get kids from all these different backgrounds just because they share certain arbitrary traits of age and things like that. We can all teach them in the same way. It seems to be odd. It seems like if they truly believed some of these ideas about diversity, they would be a lot more supportive of the dissolution of the current education systems, and encouraging things like homeschooling and things like that. But that's not at all what we see happening with a lot of these people.
Yeah. So next up, we're going to talk about some empirical work on student evaluations. So I don't know if I'm saying these names. Bob Uttle, it's Uttel. Uttle, I'm not sure how he pronounces it.
Uttel,
Carmela White and Daniel Wong Gonzalez. So I don't know if Daniel Wong Gonzalez is Chinese and Spanish or what, but did the most recent state-of-the-art meta-analysis on student evaluations. The short of it is that whatever these SETs measure, it isn't learning caused by the professor. SET scores and student learning are unrelated. Previous studies on this showed that students with professors whom they gave the high SET scores learned more, but these had errors in them. So, for example, not controlling for a student's prior aptitude or failing to do a multi-section study. So multi-section study is where the course has many equivalent sections following the same outline and having the same assessments. Having the same assessments. Students are randomly assigned to the sections. Each section is taught by a different instructor. All instructors are evaluated using SETs at the same time, before and after, so at the same time and before a final exam. And student learning is assessed using the same final exam. If students learn more, there should be a positive correlation between the SETs and scores. So what they do is they take the same class, but they have different professors teach it, put different students in these classes, and then they compare what did they learn at the beginning to what did they learn at the end. But a lot of these previous studies on the student evaluations didn't do this. And like they said, they didn't measure prior student performance. So if you have someone who's a top student and they ace classes later, well, the student has an aptitude for the school system, but that doesn't really compare versus someone who may have been struggling before but then did well later, or someone who did the same, etc.
So many things to look for.
Exactly, yeah. So then D.E. Clayson did a similar but less rigorous meta-analysis a bit earlier using 42 different studies and found there's actually a negative relationship between SET ratings and class rigor, which I'll get more on this below. He concluded that the more rigorous classes improve student achievements in later courses, but students do punish their teachers with a lower mark. So that's like my French teacher. She would have gotten low marks, but ultimately you'd be better off being in that class. He made similar observations to what Udall and his co-authors did. Earlier tests of the SETs produced more positive results, but again, that was flawed methodology. In general, it seems like the more controlled the experiment, the worse it looks for SETs. So any thoughts or comments on that?
As I mentioned, there's just so many things that could just muck those things up entirely. There could be something as simple as, depending on when the people actually enrolled in the school or something like that, or their ages, when their birthdays are, that means they're older on average than the other students, or there's a higher chance that they started dating earlier. Then the average length of relationships is going to be like 3 or 4 months. So by the time you're actually taking this, there's higher chances that these people have ended the relationship or in a different mindset, whereas these other people are just starting their relationship in a different mindset. There's so many things you could just like use, just muck up some of these things that it's difficult. Again, we're talking about evaluations. How are some of these things actually being evaluated? It's tough. I don't know.
So many researchers actually find the SET is reliable. Again, going back to our scientific definition, it keeps measuring the same thing, but it's not valid. Although some would argue it's both unreliable and invalid. So even positive traits from professors, such as how much output a professor has, how prestigious they are, et cetera, that doesn't get factored into the evaluation. So you can have a professor who wins a Nobel Prize, but the students don't like him, so he'll get low marks. But obviously, you're not going to say that person's not good at what they do, so that's misleading as well. And course evaluations do appear to measure how likable and fun a professor is. So, for example, there was a Dr. Fox experiment done in 1973 where they had a good-looking, charismatic, energetic lecturer give a nonsensical lecture on mathematical game theory and its application to physical education. Participants rated the lecture highly. So they've done subsequent findings, similar studies, and they've shown the same things. Professors who tell jokes and are entertaining in other ways receive higher marks than those who don't. Charismatic traits influence scores. Some researchers are even worried that the SET is more like a personality test rather than a serious evaluation. One study asked students to rate the professors on their Big Five personality scores. The Big Five are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Jordan Peterson talks about these all the time. After only 5 minutes of exposure, they then asked the students to evaluate them in both 10 and 6, both after week 10 and week 16. They also asked the students to rate the effectiveness in teaching. In the end, there was a very high correlation between the two criteria, resulting in about 64 to 73% correlation. So teachers that had more positive personality traits were also considered more effective teachers. Michael Humer, he's been on Tom Woods and elsewhere. He cited a similar study which showed a 76 to 84% correlation. And they also showed that apparently the better looking a professor were, they got a 0.8 boost in score. So that's almost a whole additional point just for being good looking. Now, the authors make the point, let's say, sort of play devil's advocate. You could argue better looking, more charismatic professors may get students to pay better attention. That may translate into better learning. It's possible, but again, it's kind of hard to prove, at least based on this data. So one tried to compare the validity of SETs by comparing the student evaluations to professors rating each other. Also, comparing it to the evaluation the deans gave. They found there was a high correlation actually between the deans and the student reviews, but they found that the evaluation compared to the professors was pretty low. And that gets tough too, because again, if professors are friends with each other, if professors don't like each other, it's like, how do professors rate other professors on how well they teach? It's kind of tough because again, it's like two professors can be friends and they can just give someone a good mark. This professor doesn't like that professor. They may give them a lower mark. They may get along, but they may disagree on how to teach. Some of these things get kind of murky again. So any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, no, that goes into something where we were talking about, okay, people say the controlled environment of the school actually helps, and there's things that go into that where we've developed, many countries have developed a system where the parents rely on schools in part for daycare, and this is K through 12 more so than university level and than college and university level. But you have that, and we've mentioned this previously, why are some teachers objecting to the remote learning and things like that? And it could be something like this, where somebody does feel the way they look is going to actually aid them in communicating to the children in person, that if they do it digitally, that won't happen. But then there is an inverse that I heard that I would be remiss not to mention, is they're also talking about the home environments of some people. Now, this is things to take into account, where some anecdotal things where people had seen some rather questionable activities going on in the homes of the kids, and then you have this thing on Zoom, so it's like they could be someone's parent walks by like unclothed in the background, and that's something that wouldn't happen in the classroom. But if you're in a Zoom call, like a community Zoom call, then all the other students see that, and there might be added things, or they might be some kind of room that may not added judgmental, where there's enough judgment of like, oh, this person has these kind of shoes, this person has this kind of what. They might be, oh, look at this person's room, like their shabby room, and then they get made fun of the room. So there's other things to kind of add when you're looking into the actual perception and understanding of learning. Now, I don't know how much that applies and affects in, as I mentioned, when you talk about the higher education, we're focusing here versus the K through 12. But yeah, those things. And an extra thing with the looks thing, there is a discrepancy in how female teachers are treated when it comes to sexual relations with their students versus the inverse of that. And that is also highly correlated to the attractiveness of said female teachers. If it's like some 55-year-old married teacher versus some young 20-something-year-old teacher, they'll have a different interaction with that. And now, the same way that you have those biases, you might rate them better, but then it might be better for you to not think what they're saying is correct, and you'll be able to notice more things as a student and actually learn better. Yeah, so there's things to kind of account for here.
And that also is just the male versus female thing. Like you're saying with your good-looking female professor, girls in the class may say, I don't like her, but they're not attracted to her, so they're not going to cloud that judgment. But then the reverse happens too. Oh, you have the hot chef for this class. Okay, they would give that chef a more favorable rating. Whereas to me, it's okay, it's just some guy. So it's like all again, and again, like I'm not knocking. Okay, if you think a person's attractive, fine, but it's like ideally you're not supposed to be rating them on those things. Like he says, it's become a personality test, and if you're there to get educated, you're not there to be friends. That's the argument that keeps coming up with Trump. It's like even a lot of people who support him are saying like, look, I mean, we're not voting for someone based on personality. He's not my friend. It's how good of a job do they do? That's the criteria. Mm-hmm. It's not like they're not there to be your buddy. That's essentially,
yeah. And there was one of my early moments also get disillusioned, going back to George Bush, where I was like, okay, like I get he doesn't seem that intelligent. He seems to be doing some things that are weird, but he seems like a guy you could just meet at the bar and have a beer with.
Yeah.
And I thought of that and I was like, okay, I can get that's kind of why some people might have voted for him. But then
Yeah.
I started getting more and more into politics. And by the time Obama came around, people were saying that same thing about him.
Yeah.
And I was like, is that really a positive thing? Like,
Yeah.
I now at that time I was like, okay, now I go to bars more.
Yeah.
I've seen the bar environment. Would I want the average person I meet at a bar running the country? Right? At that point, I'm like,
Yeah.
you guys must be going to much better bars than I'm going to.
Yeah.
Like, I want the person running the country to be somebody where it's like that person would not even want to spend a second talking to me because they're at such a higher level, they're doing such more important things that they wouldn't be wasting time at the bar. They'd be
Yeah.
doing some other like productive stuff. Those are the kind of people. Like if there actually was a sort of elite, I would want the elites to actually, if they actually would want Illuminati, it's almost like Illuminati actually would be better if there actually was some kind of selected group of people that really was more capable at running stuff. When it comes down to it, and we don't really have a system that really organizes for that. Like you could say, like monarchies in a way had, like I think even monarchies in a way had more of a system of selecting certain kind of traits in order to be an effective ruler, and that's more due to the fact that you had a system where the person was more invested in the future of this country because their children were going to hire it. And then that self-interest of them looking forward for themselves and their kids over everybody else, the best way to ensure that positive for their future was to make sure the country was as comfortable and peaceful as possible so their kids could inherit that and keep going with that generational wise. Because if you lost that, chances are your family line was dying. You were done.
Yeah.
You're dead. But at the same point, it might have had a system that was better at selecting for success, for good people at it. But it also had a system that selected, like, if you got a crap person, it was crap for everyone, and those people were embedded. So right now, with the democracy, as they say, it's the best of the possible evils that we have. It might not select for a class that's much better at doing what they're doing, but also create some kind of systems and checks and balances with some term limits in certain parts of it, where these people, if they're bad, there's a way to remove that person, and you're not just damned with these people for in perpetuity and things like that. So yeah.
So to sort of add on to your points, I think you're sort of citing Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe. I highly recommend that book to anyone who hasn't read it. He basically makes the argument. Well, he's an anarcho-capitalist. He's not arguing for monarchy, but he's making the point that in the case of monarchy, monarchs were invested in maintaining their kingdom because they're going to pass it on to their kids and then their grandkids, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas these democratically elected politicians, they're milking the cow as much as they can, and then if the problems emerge, oh well, I'm out of office or dead, I don't really care. So they're not thinking, Obama's not thinking, oh, what's the country going to look like in 50, 100 years? Because he'll be gone, so who cares?
Yeah.
And then the other thing I was going to add about bar scenes, I laugh. One of my good friends, Abram, I actually met at a bar, but he's probably like the only one that I've actually had like a long lasting relationship with. We met at the 8th Street wine cellar near where I used to work. So occasionally you do, but again, it's like you say, do I want the average person I would sit at the bar with running things based on who I've met? No, probably not.
Yeah. That is a good point. I used to smoke. I definitely used to smoke cigarettes and things like that. And one of my really good friends I actually met because I was in a bar in San Francisco a couple of times, and then you had to smoke outside, so there was like a smoking area, and that person was out there, and then so there are those things. But then again, we're self-selecting. That's why I'm thinking the bars these people must go to are also very self-selecting. Like I didn't just go to any bar. Like there was some reason I was at that bar versus the many other bars I could have been at. So I'm thinking for somebody to just use that average person at the bar, because even at that bar itself, I wasn't talking to every single person. These were a select group of people within that bar. So I'm not just like down on bar culture, because a lot of people are great people out there. And there's a lot of people in my life who I value who, if I wasn't at the bar, but you can't really compare that because I can't say like who would I have met if I was like at the library or something. But anyway, I've met some good people at bars. So
because again, like with this place, it's a wine bar. So it's a little pricier. So in general, you're going to attract people who are more into that kind of thing. Whereas like, I used to love going to college dive bars when I was like 22 or something. Now it's just like, it's a waste of time. Like I remember I went with Abram and one of our mutual friends. I felt so out of place there. Like good looking girls and stuff, but I'm like, okay, it's noisy. I have to shout at the person next to me. I'm not going to have meaningful conversations with anyone here. It's like, why am I here? And it was one of those things. We went because our friend wanted to go, and I was like, all right, I'll humor him. But it's like, would I go here on my own? No.
This again repeats
Yeah.
the importance and this the title of this paragraph on reading entrails or entrails. Why do I keep saying entrails? Like entrails and student evaluations
Yeah.
is what are you selecting for? How many
Yeah.
other parts of our life do we select on the way schools are selected, either the school you attend to or the way people are evaluated, the quality of that relationship? There's many other things that I think are far less important than schooling that we hold to much higher standards of selection and confirmation to actually consider something positive or even something to do. You know, like the amount of the research people do just to like order some food versus like pick a university sometimes is an entirely different thing. It's a strange kind of situation. Yeah.
Well, and I think it was Peter Schiff or someone who made that argument about democracy in general, like how think about how selective people are in buying TVs or computers or clothes, all that. But then their candidate, oh well, this person's a member of my party. Oh, they look good. Oh, they're a member of my race. Oh, it's funny the disconnect, like the amount of thought that goes into one thing versus not the other. But what is the impact one has versus the other?
Yeah, it's almost like we have a sweet spot where it's like if something is above in complexity, it's something we don't deal with. If something is too low, we just don't even account for it. There's like everybody has that kind of middle area where it's like, okay, this is our bailiwick thing. Yeah. Huh.
So moving on, part of the problem is we don't know how to measure teaching effectiveness in a way that is A, valid and reliable, B, inexpensive and easy to do on a large scale. So, for example, one of the issues here is that to have some more of these controlled experiments, you would have to eliminate student choice because you would have to take people who aren't as apt in certain areas and see how did they progress when they're put to the challenge. Whereas the issue now, I think, is because people pick their majors, not saying it's a bad thing, but people are going to gravitate towards things that they're better at. So they're going to make an effort to study harder and all that. So you can't really test, okay, if this person put into a tough situation, how would they handle it versus they're self-selecting for something that's easier and they want to do. And to be fair, again, to the colleges, there isn't some quick and easy answer to this, but I think we need to at least acknowledge these metrics don't work. They're invalid. They're unreliable. And I think it should at least be considered, are there better ways to do this? So some people have attempted to defend this. So a JV Adams says that student evaluations are valid ways of measuring student satisfaction. And of course, one could argue that professors should be rewarded based on if students like them. But again, that gets into, okay, what are they basing their like off of? We could debate the merits of that in depth, but it should be made. But it seems they seem to just be arguing, okay, we want students to be happy. So again, students generally punish professors who make things difficult. Mary Gray and Barbara Bergman said that in one study, 72% of professors said that the reliance on SETs actually encourages students to water down their content. A study at Duke University by statistician Valen Johnson showed that expectations of grades influence ratings, so professors are incentivized to give better grades. So professors will give students better grades because they want the higher markings. And there's two strange defenses of SETs, which I'll read out here. One is the confusion in the literature does not justify abolition of student ratings. Few university policies have a truly quote unquote scientific basis. For example, where are the studies of the validity of faculty peer evaluation process as a form of consumer control? Student ratings have a useful place. That was from D.A. Dowell and J.A. Neal. The next one is, sure, the SET is not a valid measure of learning. However, if a professor continually receives very low average scores, say 1s and 2s, that probably means something bad is going on. So the SET should be used as part of the evaluation process, but deans and fellow faculty just need to use the scores the right way, quote unquote. So again, it's not clear that students can really judge if professors are teaching badly based on low scores, because as we sort of talked about, this could just reflect personal preference and things like that. If everyone were to give low scores, okay, that would raise some red flags. But to use the example above, if some give 1, some give 2s and 3s, some gives 5s, that could mean a lot of different things. And this to me, if they're just used the right way, that's the usual, oh, we just need better people to run things, we just need better people in charge. It has some sort of ideal behavior theory, which I reject completely. And then in the next section, we're going to get into how deans use the SETs the wrong way. Did you have anything to add before we continue, or? Sure.
It's also something, an additional thing with the students. The students first of all choose certain subjects that they feel more comfortable with, so chances are they'll be doing better in. But then even on top of that, the universities in general choose the students. So if a university is doing its job well, it will choose students that fit its environment in a certain way. So chances are they'll enjoy that in a better way than your average person that's not selected for. But then now to test for that, maybe if you get students that are in there more on affirmative action versus students that are selected on the just general merit type of place, then maybe you can see like, oh, these kids who were just added in affirmative action, maybe if they had been maybe they've been selected by a place that's more based off of merit, they would have found a place that's more fitting. And I think you see some of that in something that we can see with actual figure with, I think there's a higher dropout rate of the affirmative action targeted groups in areas that have affirmative action. Like I think I've seen some studies, and don't quote me 100% on this, but focusing on California schools, and they looked at the Latinos and the Black people in universities. I think it was things like USC, Stanford, those kind of areas where there's affirmative action quotas, and they look at those students, and those students on average have a higher dropout rate than just the rest of the student body, both, and also just counting Latinos and other people. If I don't know if there's a way to figure out which Latinos were hired on affirmative action and which
Yeah.
which ones were accepted in affirmative action, which ones weren't. But I think it was Thomas Sowell was talking about this or something.
Yeah.
They were talking about how there is a higher one because somebody will be selected to be put in a university that on merit they might have done better at a school that's a little lower where they'd be at top of the class. Yet you mentioned this before also in one of the other parts, versus being put in one where they're in the middle of the class or the bottom of the class, and they're getting left behind. And so there's many things to account for.
We'll get more into this in the next section too, on how grades are calculated and some of the issues with that, because that combined with this, you can see compounded, it creates a lot of issues. And what you're saying here is sort of interesting, because I remember in high school that when I was in a math class, there were these two students who were always getting A's, and I kind of wondered like why they weren't in honors math. And I was talking to my teacher one-on-one, and he was saying, he's like, I feel like they're in the right class. And he's like, because what it is that they're getting the material as it's taught. Like they're just learning at that rate, but they're working hard. That's how they get the good grades. And he's like, but to be in honors math, you have to be able to sort of think outside the box and be able to learn things without being taught. And there was another kid in the class. He's like, he shows that potential as far as his ability with math, but he's not applying himself. So it's like, I couldn't comfortably put him in honors math because he would slack off and he might barely pass, if at all. And then it'd be like, well, why are you here? Versus with them, it's like, they're working their hardest, they're learning, but they're still being challenged. But because they're working hard, that's getting the good grades. So it's like, I think you have to sort of control for those factors as well.
Yeah.
So it is. So the next factor is, why won't universities fix the problem? So other studies show that administrators like the SETs, but the faculty don't. Administrators seem to agree that students do rate professors more highly on personal things, and they don't seem to want to talk about how they don't really agree that these aren't good measures for grading and other things. So why do the administrators stand by these? In short, it's not really clear. Some think it may be sort of rational ignorance, like, oh, it's just easy, defer to the students, let them do it, and just go by that. Don't take the time, money, energy to implement a new system. So the authors came up with a few reasons as to why they maintain these. Number one, they're cheap and easy to implement. Number two, valid measures would be expensive and difficult to implement. Number three, to add on to the last 2 points, nearly everyone uses this format, so it's easier. A new system would be costly and time consuming to acquire and implement. So like, that's the example that comes up about metric versus the system that we use. Like, okay, to switch over to create a whole new system, how hard would that be to actually implement in practice? Some people's jobs depend on keeping these in place. So if you think about like a good looking charismatic professor is always going to get high marks. So they're going to, if someone tries to take these away, they're going to fight back against this. So the administrators wouldn't feel like fighting back against that. Students don't know that the SET is invalid, so it makes students think the universities care about teaching more than it actually does and is trying to improve it, and it makes the students feel like they have more power than they do. And as long as the administrators rely on these, they can use these to sort of control faculty and wield power. Oh, look, your students are giving you bad evaluations. We need to have a talk. Versus, okay, if they're getting good evaluations, they can say, hey, look, the professors are doing a good job. Everything's fine here. So those were the 6 things that they came up with.
Yeah.
And it sort of relates to some of the other things we talked about, but faculty and administrators have strong incentives to try and control each other. If a professor gets distinguished from research and things, they know that that gives them power over administrators. So if someone offers them a good job, they can say, hey, I'll only stay if you pay me more money, or things like that. But then in turn, administrators also want to control those faculty and find ways to keep them in place and all that. So there's sort of that tug of war as far as power is concerned. And this ultimately gives power to the administrators the way the divination rites gave power to the high priest. So that's back to our initial point. And in conclusion, SETs may serve some other valuable purpose, but it's not clear. But they certainly don't provide effective information on teaching criteria. So that's all I have. Silas, did you have any more comments or thoughts on this whole section?
No, again, it's like you said, it's not the evaluation of teaching criteria. What is this selecting for? It definitely evaluates for something.
Yeah.
I mean, with a lot of these people, there's very good chances that if you just had people segregated by race, segregated by religion, segregated by, I don't know, favorite football team, favorite dessert, there might be ways to get an environment where the people feel more comfortable with the individual that is the teacher of the class. But are you selecting for comfort, or are you selecting for ability? Are you selecting for how many students have gone on to actually understand? Let's say you go 10 years down the line, how many students still remember anything that was taught by this teacher? If this is a teacher that's a head of a certain department, let's say it's a biology department, how many of the person's students 20 years down the line are still employed in biology? Like, these are the kind of things where if this thing with Obama, when they get this thing, or this like a meme thing, is like if anyway. So if people are accurate in saying that the main aspect of school is information being learned, then how much of the people of what they major in is still actually what they actually achieve to do in the future? That should be one of the central ways. There should be more ways to figure out the actual important information from this person to the other. And I don't even think you will necessarily see it that much higher in Ivy League schools, because I think with Ivy League schools, there's also a lot of other things on the side where you meet people, you go to the sororities, you go to the fraternities. People come back to sporting events or different events in your department. Then you get employed as a apprentice, not apprentice, but you get employed as an intern. So your summer kind of internships. These kind of things build your connections, or you meet somebody who you marry who's already in these kind of circles, and you see that. Like, why is it like something? I think they said like 25% of the people in the CIA or something or higher are from the Ivy League schools.
Yeah.
And it's 8. It's 8 schools. That is 8 schools out of the 9,000 schools available. It happened to be 25% of the people in the CIA. Is that just because these schools are the smartest people in the world, or is it other kind of connections and things that are involved to actually enter the CIA, enter some of these organizations? Why is it that, like, with politicians, who supposedly with politicians, they're just people that are selected from a general public, people voting and picking people to actually enter certain positions? Why is it that I don't know what percentage, I guess you could probably check and see, I might check this out and see, but I bet a high percent of politicians' children happen to go to Ivy Leagues, higher than on average of any other position, or almost any other job, or like it's kind of a job. Oh, what do you call it? Any other like pastime, any other thing that they do. I think you'll find politicians happen to have a really high level of number of people in Ivy League schools, kids. Now, are we somehow saying that there is something about politics, as we talked about at the start, where I was mentioning that one politician who was talking about the coyotes? Are we supposed to say that because something about people are smart enough to vote for the smartest people who happen to have some genetic aspects of having smart kids as well, or something about being around people like David Hogg make you better at being a CIA agent? I don't think it's simply just like the institution itself. There are other things that are being selected for by going to certain locations and certain places and things like that. Yeah, so I think that's it. Saying this was the end of the chapter?
Yeah, I was gonna make one comment though. Did you ever see that thing Howard Stern did on his show where they interviewed Obama voters both elections, where they were trying to prove that they thought a lot of black voters were voting for Obama because he was black rather than his policies. And now they didn't have a huge sample size, but what they did in both cases was they took McCain or Romney's policies but applied them to Obama, and they're like, do you like that Obama wants to stay in Iraq and finish this war? Oh yeah. Do you like that Obama opposes stem cell research? Oh yeah, absolutely, I agree. So things like that. And then I remember I told someone about this, and they were like, oh, it's probably a small minority who does that. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, again, they didn't interview a huge sample size, but again, it's like, if Obama had been a white man, would all these people be rushing out to support him? I think it's worth at least asking that. And it's like, you have to control for all those variables. And again, that's what we've been talking about for the last 2 hours, is that if you're just going to select if you're just like, oh, this professor's good looking, I like them, that doesn't really evaluate how much you're learning. It's the same thing here. It's like, oh, some black guy, that doesn't mean his policies are inherently good. I think I don't feel bad for saying that in any way.
Yeah. And that's another thing. By the time this is posted, I think Donald Trump is starting his second term already, and that's one thing that I was having a discussion with somebody in the comment section on my social media. Is like, was talking about the actual debate, and like some of the primary parts of the debate is telling people information, undecided voters mostly, information about the other person or yourself that they don't know already, that they haven't found from other sources. So some of the things in specific, they're talking about the cages that were built, the images that were shown of the cages, some cages holding some of the children who were brought over through the illegal migration over the southern border of the United States of America. And President Trump was asking candidate Biden, who built the cages? Who built the cages? And then somebody commented and was saying, oh, well, at most that makes them seem like they do it the same. So it's kind of a similar thing. So it's not really that big of a deal. But I'm like, no. The thing is, there has been a perception that Joe Biden is above that.
Yeah.
That Barack Obama's term was a term that didn't have any scandals. So if those pictures and those cages are one of the scandals, one of the myriad of scandals under Trump, then why was it not a scandal when they took this picture of those cages during the actual time the actual time when Obama and Biden were in?
Yeah.
So when you have that kind of situation where somebody has a perception of them being at a higher level, then you get to that point, and that is something that I kind of see is there, where people just have that one thing where we're on this side, we're better than you, in a certain way, and then that's the part that I don't get, and I think that is something that is carried on into universities and things like that. People are like, I went to university, so I'm better than you. I went to this university, so I'm better than you. And it's not necessarily based on, and even goes down to horoscopes. This person is of this horoscope, so they're better for me to date, and those kind of things, where it's like, why are you using these odd criteria to select for? What are those things selecting for, and how confident are you? How accurate are they? How worthwhile is that perception of how worthwhile is your evaluation of the kind of thing that you're using and the tools? You talked about reliable versus
valid.
Reliable versus what was the term? Versus valid. And I think we should go more to the valid ones versus the reliable things, and then we won't be judging fish by their ability to ride bicycles, which I think is one of the common ones that's used for this kind of thing. Yeah.
All right, that's all I have. So.
Okay, so that's it. Thank you for listening to this part.
Thank you.
Stephen, stay on for a bit longer. I think we will. This is the third day we recorded in a row, so I don't think we'll be recording the next part today, but the next part is going to be Chapter 5, Grades, Communication Breakdown, and we'll schedule the recording of that next. But everybody who's listened, thank you very much for listening. As I mentioned, if you haven't listened to any of the other of this series and you'd like to, at least a suggestion, or my suggestion, I think Stevens as well will second this, is read the one we have on the definitions about the 7
big economic insights, and also
economic insights. Go ahead.
Normative and descriptive business questions. I think it was 3 and 4. I forget which is which.
Yeah. So that one is there. I'll try to leave a link to that below in the low bar or somewhere on the screen or somewhere. I suggest that should be something that should be taken in before more of the rest of this series, but there should be at least 4 other parts out, and the other parts will be coming out subsequently. So that's it for me. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.